presentation itself is on the new 7th edition, which just came out. The electronic version is available. The actual printed copy is kind of behind, but you can, if you're a member of PMI, get a copy of this and download it. And I definitely would recommend that you do it and start reading through it. It is much easier to read than the previous 6th edition. I do have to put this disclaimer in here mainly because these slides are from PMI specifically. I've worked very closely with them, both on the 7th edition as well as with the new PMP exam. So I have their slides, but what I say about them is really some of my opinion as well as theirs. So I do have to have that disclaimer in here. So before we start on the 7th edition, though, I want to make one point because I had to respond to a LinkedIn this morning again. The PMP exam is not, and I repeat, not based on this 7th edition. The PMP exam was written and all the questions done a couple of years ago, and those are actually out there. They have been there for a couple of years. The exam itself is based on the exam content outline, which you can get. It is also based on about 12 different references, one of which is the 6th edition. Now, there is not a need that every time we get a new edition of the PMBOK guide to have a new edition of the exam. The exam is on its own schedule, its own release schedule, which is about every 3 years. And as a result, actually, the exam content outline for this was generated almost two years ago, even though it never took place because of COVID and other things. But as a result, the exam is still based on the 6th edition as well as a number of other references. So it's not that you don't want to look at the 7th. It will give you information, but it is not going to be the way that the PMP exam is done. So with that, let me just go on and let's talk about the 7th edition then. Okay, so the whole question is, why did we need to change? And this is a dramatic change as we move from the 6th edition to the 7th. And part of that is based on the fact that PMI came up with a strategic plan. And this was back in that should be 2017. And I apologize for that. I just now saw that. But it's taken that long to kind of put all the pieces in place. But the idea was we're doing things differently. And as a result, we need to change somewhat the way we do projects. So they went and talked to a number of focus groups. And obviously, it's still the PMBOK guide itself is still considered very credible and highly regarded around the world. It is a global standard, but it needs to be more responsive to the market and to the way projects are done. There was also a feeling that it was much more focused on predictive work. Now, predictive meaning things that have been done previously that can follow a plan, etc., construction, engineering, those type of things. Even though I'll have to stop a second because I am teaching somebody who actually was a construction manager and is now in IT, and he actually thinks that construction has to be more adaptive than IT. Once you start building, things can go wrong. So even though maybe the build is predictive, the rest is different. So once again, it's a matter of opinion. As a result, people kept saying, well, this is out of step with practice, and especially with all the agile ideas. But, and I have to agree with the last one, it is hard to read. The 6th edition was very hard to read. It was not meant to teach you how to do project management. It was a reference. It was something that you could look up and learn from, but it was not meant to be that training document or to tell you how to go from one step to the next. So actually, the PMBOK guide has gone through a lot of changes. And I didn't have a chance to put in here, but I actually have a copy of the 1996 edition. I hate to say it, but that's where I started looking at how things could be done. That was based on just a white paper that had been done a couple of years before. It went through a couple of revisions up to where they finally started to call it the third edition. There was something in between the 96 and the third, which they don't call the second edition, but it basically was. The third edition was when they finally started to get associated with ANSI, American National Standards Institute. And that is where things started to become a little bit more structured. So from the third to the sixth, it just kind of kept adding more things. And you'll notice that as they added new knowledge areas specifically, they didn't put them logically where they belong. They just kind of added them to the end. So the sixth was where they started to make a pretty good change into this idea of having different approaches, including the Agile approach itself. They changed a lot of the information up front. For instance, one of the things was the role of the project manager, starting to move them from a project manager to a leader. And that leadership concept is one that has really permeated through everything going forward now. This comes right out of the 7th edition, so you can read all about it. And they always talk about how things have changed from one release to the next. So really, this transformation that happened as we went from the 6th really looks at 7 different areas. So overall, the approach in the 6th edition was more prescriptive. This is how you would do things. Emphasis on that, not what and why that you needed to do. Whereas in the 7th now, what we've moved to is principles that kind of guide that mindset and the work that we're doing, making it more value-driven, customer-oriented, things like that. Very different from the standpoint of explaining kind of the what and the why, not so much the how. When we got into the design itself, in the 6th edition, it was structured around the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. Very definitely those ETOs that everybody started to memorize, especially for the exam. When we move to the 7th edition, it's moving more into the idea of domains, which are interactive, different activities that help make sure we have outcomes, not necessarily products and results, but also providing information about various tools and techniques that can be used. But really those outcomes are where the emphasis is now, not just the deliverables that you normally would see within a methodology. The project environment really didn't change. We still talk about the internal environment that a project operates within, as well as the external. And the external, remember, can be not only external to your project, but also external to the organization and all of those impacts that would have on the project itself. The other thing that was interesting is that in the 6th edition, they kept saying this is applicable to most projects most of the time. And what they really strived to do on the 7th was to try to make this so that it applied to any project. And I think you've probably heard, some of you that have heard me speak before, hear me say that project management to me is a life skill. Everything I do is a project. Now, maybe some of these projects are very small, maybe they're personal, maybe they're very large, but regardless, the same concepts apply regardless of the project I'm doing. Now, the target audience was interesting here, and this started happening when we did the Agile Practice Guide and the Business Analysis Practice Guide, and we started at PMI to look beyond just the project manager and look at those individual resources or team members and the roles that they may play, and they could change. So not necessarily do you have the same person being the project manager all the time. Maybe it gets into a technical aspect, and so maybe one of the technical leads becomes the, in effect, project manager. So the 7th edition is more looking at the roles, not necessarily just the project manager. The change itself in the 6th edition was just an incremental change from previous editions. We go back to the 5th, they added the stakeholder knowledge area. In the 6th, they added the agile concepts. It was an incremental approach to developing them, as opposed to this one, which is really completely looking at it differently. And rather than talking about how do we just modify a little bit, it was just, let's go back to the basic principles and look at how we're going to deliver the value from the work that we do. Now, in the 6th edition, up on the front part of each one of the knowledge areas, there was a small section that talked about how you might have to tailor this to meet different environments. Here, what has happened is they've pulled this tailoring out into its own section and provided a lot more guidance on how you would modify certain things based on the context of the project. And that's going to be one of the key things, and actually came from Discipline Agile, because Discipline Agile, when PMI brought them into the fold, the very first thing that you do is you look at the context of the project and therefore decide then how best to perform that work. So the structure itself of the PMBOK of the 7th edition, and I want to keep calling it the 7th edition because it really has two different pieces to it. It has this standard, which is actually the ANSI standard, as well as what we more frequently talk about as far as the PMBOK guide. So those two have been put together into the 7th edition. What's kind of interesting is, first of all, they've reversed the order of this, because in the 6th edition, the front part had to do with the PMBOK guide itself, the processes, the knowledge areas, all of those aspects were in the first part of the 6th edition. And then in the back was the actual ANSI standard. And that ANSI standard then went through by process group. And it was not as tool and technique oriented as was the actual PMBOK guide portion. In the 7th edition, they've reversed this, and they put the standard in first. And this is the ANSI standard. And this is actually one of the reasons why it was so delayed in coming out, because this had to be reviewed by ANSI. And ANSI has a 3-year requirement to go back through the standard. So this standard itself talks about the value delivery, and it talks about these various principles. Those are the areas to focus on from the standpoint of project management. Not telling you how to do it, but what is this whole concept? And we'll look at a couple of these. In the back, in the second part of it, which is really what we would consider the PMBOK itself, instead of it being done by processes and process groups and knowledge areas, it's now based on domains, performance domains, somewhat similar to the previous knowledge areas, etc., but looking at it more from a holistic point of view. And then what they've done is the tools and techniques that were so heavy in the 6th edition and previous editions, they've moved into this PMI Standards Plus, which is a digital aspect where if you want to, for instance, know how to do a risk management plan, you go to the PMI Standards Plus, you can look up what that risk management plan is, how you would do it, different techniques, and it's in a mode that can be easily updated. So it will continue to evolve because by putting it into this digital content platform, it allows that refresh more often than what would happen if it's actually in a printed document. So if we look at the actual pieces of these, the standard itself is broken down into 3 sections. The introduction, which has the purpose and the key terms and the concepts and the audience, kind of similar to what we've seen before. And then the second part has to do with this idea of value delivery system, or the context in which these projects operate. And you're going to see this term value driven all the way through. And that's something that came out and was very critical when we talked about agile mindset, making sure that we prioritize things based on the value itself. And then the third part has to do with the actual principles themselves. The value-driven delivery, as I said, this is one of those areas where, once again, we take the project and we look at it within that bigger frame, where not just creating the value, but understanding there are certain ways that the organization has put in place that we have to follow. Now, sometimes those governance, as we talk about them, are the result of compliance. They're the result of things that are coming because we have external working here. The actual functions in the project refers to the people, the roles, the different things that have to be performed, not necessarily calling out the actual positions that have to be there. But for instance, a good example is somebody needs to do the analysis, somebody needs to do the design, somebody has to do some of the quality check. Those are those functions they're talking about. The project environment that we're meeting in. And then this last part that talks about product management. What's interesting is when you really look at Agile, it so is based back on a lot of the areas of product management. And I actually had the opportunity to be a product manager for about 4 years for a software product. And when you start to look at how product are rolled out, how they're updated, that whole idea of the roadmap for a product become part of what you have to look at as far as the project. So the portfolio management, program management, project management, product management kind of all start to fit together here. The principles themselves. Now, what's interesting here, there's 12 principles they talk about. I have pulled out a couple of these just to kind of give you an idea of the things that are there and how they're defined. But these are good practices. This is very readable. I mean, I can't tell you how different this is from the 6th edition. It's much more patterned after the way the program management standard 4th edition was written, where it talks about what it's all about, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. So here, for example, I just pulled out a couple. Value, focus on value. Continually evaluate and adjust the project alignment to the business objectives and the intended benefits and value. So they're talking more about not just the value, but the benefits that are going to be created as a result of the project. And if you'll remember, that benefit was really the definition of a program. But now it's looking at the fact that even a project should be providing some, even just interim benefits. Another one has to do with change. So in this case, once again, we're not talking about change control. This is where we start to finally move more into change management. But preparing those that are going to receive what we're doing so that they can transition from the current state they're in to in some type of a future state, which is supported by the outcomes that we're doing on the project itself. This is really moving from that as is to the to be, and making sure, though, that we don't go back to the as was. Another one has to do with systems thinking. Sorry, I hit it too fast. Where we recognize, evaluate, and respond to dynamic circumstances, both within and surrounding the project, so that we can change and positively have that impact on the project performance itself. This is the adaptation of being able to recognize when we need to make that change itself. So there are 12 of these principles. Each one are explained in the standard, very readable. I would definitely have you recommend that you go take a look at these. They're not telling you how to do it. They're telling you what it is that we need to be striving to do. As far as the PMBOK, or the guide itself, as they call it, this is made up of what's called performance domains. Now, you'll see some of these look kind of familiar, maybe close to what we did as far as some of the knowledge areas, but the performance domains themselves are really those focus areas that we need to look at in order to deliver this project. Now, they're interdependent and overlapping, which is kind of what the knowledge areas were supposed to be also. But because of the way that the PMBOK Guide 6th edition and previous had been structured, it looked like each one had to be done independently. Here, they're very definitely looking at how they interrelate to each other. The focus is not on what are we creating, not the outputs, but rather the outcome. And you'll see this term if you go back into the program standard. And I would highly recommend, even if you're a project manager and not really doing programs, pick up the 4th edition of the program standard and look at how it talks about putting things together, talks about stakeholders and risk and any sort of things that have to do with benefit realization. Those are the outputs that each one of the components or the projects are going to give in order to move into the full benefit that's being delivered. Now, when we start talking about these benefits and the value that's delivered, it could be frequently as we do small things, especially in Agile, if we are going to deliver incremental results all the way through, maybe periodically, maybe we do an upgrade every quarter, whatever. So we're on a kind of on a regularly scheduled basis. We provide that value. In some cases, we were just talking about Hoover Dam, Hoover Dam. I still want to call it Boulder Dam because that was what it was originally called, and it's Boulder City. But the benefits on that dam were not delivered until the dam was completely finished. The same for the bridge that bypasses the dam now. There was no benefit until the bridge is completely finished. So some cases, that's the only way we can deliver the benefits. In other cases, we're encouraged to try to do things in smaller increments. Those, as we said, interactive, interrelated, and interdependent. So all of these areas kind of fit together. You look at them, but you have to look at how they impact each other. Kind of similar what we talked about when we move from the triple constraint of just saying the only constraints we had on a project were scope, schedule, and cost. But we all know we had constraints as far as resources and quality, those type of things. So all of those can impact what we're doing. What we need to look at is how they, even though they're independent and working individually, we have to see how those all work together. So just one example here. At the beginning of each domain, there's a graphic such as this that talks about what the definition is of the domain and what some of the desired outcomes should be within that particular domain. So here, once again, observable outcomes, that if these activities in this domain are effective, are going to be available. And then at the end, there's a summary of how you might measure to evaluate whether those objectives are being achieved. So each one of these, and I didn't go into detail here because I don't have time in this presentation to go through all of that, but a lot of this really gets into understanding these different performance domains. And you'll recognize stakeholders specifically as being kind of the last thing they added as a knowledge area in the 6th edition. It actually is a domain in program management all by itself. Kind of shows how PMI has moved that importance of the stakeholder up to a much higher level. So another part of the guide, in addition to those performance domains, is this whole new section on how to tailor what we're doing. And part of this is because what we want to do is look at there's not a single way to do a project. And I think we all are aware of that. We've said it for years. This is suggestions, but not limited to ways of doing things, and not everything always applies. What they did was they brought all of this into a single section where we start out and we have to identify how we're initially going to do the work, what kind of approach we're going to use, and maybe tailor it a little bit based on the context of the project, maybe tailoring it based on the organization, and then put that into play, but continue to monitor it to see maybe we need to make a few adjustments. Because we don't want, think about this like if you're driving, I'm in northern San Diego County, driving down into San Diego proper. I get my GPS and it tells me, okay, this is the best road to go. But as I am going, it is continually looking to see maybe there's some traffic or maybe there's an accident or a stoppage on the road, and it'll give me a way to go around it. That whole thing is a matter of saying we choose the first route and then we have to monitor as we go through to see if there are changes that have to be made. If you're not aware of the Discipline Agile and the Choose Your WOW or Way of Working book, it is available on PMI for free download. I would highly suggest you look at that. It really is a toolkit of a lot of different things that can be applied. Just the whole concept of, once again, looking at the context of the project first and then determining how best to approach it. A lot of that has been incorporated into here also, but giving us that flexibility to make some changes in addition to whatever the organization has put in place. So the other part of this, which is kind of interesting, is we didn't really get rid of all the tools and techniques or these documents itself. What they've done is they've moved them into a separate section, which has kind of a high-level description of a lot of these different models, methods, and artifacts, as they call them. So by definition, by definition, a model is a way of looking at something as far as a strategy or process. We've talked about models in business analysis for years, where we had a graphic and a text that explained things in more detail. The method is, in many cases, some of the ways that you actually do things, the process itself, may be resulting in a deliverable. And the idea of an artifact is anything. So the artifact is the term they're using more generically, rather than just saying you have work products or deliverables or documents, whatever. They're using the term artifact. So in addition, what this is doing is a lot of this detail is in this PMI Standards Plus. So some examples, for instance, if I look at some of the models, maybe the situational leadership model, maybe communication model, motivation, change, complexity, team development, the process groups, the methods themselves, maybe data gathering and analysis methods or techniques, estimating, how you might run meetings, events, things in there, for instance, like how do you do a retrospective or a lessons learned meeting? And then your artifacts. And once again, artifacts are kind of anything that you create, that you're working with, some of which get kept at the end of the project. Some of them are working documents, but those are all considered to be artifacts. So if we start to look at how this all fits together, we end up having the principles which are guiding the behavior, and those are the things that are actually explained when you get into the standard part of the guide now, the 7th edition. Those principles are guiding that behavior for all of these different performance domains. And those performance domains just look at different aspects that may be considered when you're working on the project. You end up having models and methods that help you with that so that you can tailor it to the context itself. Through that process, based on the organization, we may have deliverables that we have to create. A lot of times we have those additional artifacts that are done. Those all become part of this system that we are using to be able to deliver value back to the organization. Obviously, within the internal environment of your organization and your project, as well as any external environment that you have to work within. So if I recap it, basically the standard went from process groups to principles. The actual guide went from knowledge areas to performance domains. The Standards Plus is where you have a lot of the information about especially the tools and techniques. And those are on standardsplus.pmi.org. Now, the other thing I'll say, is that there is another website, which is the one that I kind of monitor a lot, this pmi.org/standards-projects. This is where the latest information is available. So all of the stuff that I've been talking about is actually part of that website itself, and that's being updated as they continue to make additional changes. So the way I summarize it is the fact that we have project delivery principles that are going to shape our behavior and our actions in general. We have the performance domains then that are the focus of our projects as we work through. We have to tailor both our actions and our decisions, not only as we start a project, but also as we're performing and we see things that need to change because they're just not working. A perfect example here gets into if we've decided to go with a time-boxed, for instance, like an agile scrum technique where we deliver something every 2 weeks. We find that we're just not able to get things down into meaningful 2-week chunks. Maybe we need to move to more of a continuous flow or a Kanban type of a method as we go through. Those are the type of things that we have to have the ability to do. And then last, we need to have these models, methods, and artifacts that we can understand and use as we go through, which then puts this all into what I think is probably the best way to summarize this. The principles overseeing the fact that we are taking these different domains, models, and methods that we tailor based on the project to create those artifacts. Now, I went out there actually in Appendix X1. It actually lists the contributors, and you'll notice that my name is actually printed there. I don't know why Steve never gets his credentials after his name. He always does these and he gets credit for it, but we both spent a good amount of time working. We really worked more on the principle aspect of this in a couple of sessions that we worked on, especially when we were in Philadelphia for the PMI LIM leadership meeting a couple of years ago. So where to go? Bookmark that particular area. Take a look at those, the Standards Plus. You know, it is a work in progress, but I will tell you that, you know, as we go through, those are going to be updated continually, and that's why they moved it into that kind of a format.